Thank you so much, and good evening to everybody, and thank you for coming tonight, and thank you very much to the Liberty Award for inviting me here to speak, and particularly for bringing me here to Berlin. My trip here is actually the very first time that I've left Brazil since I began reporting on the documents once I left Hong Kong. That was almost 10 months ago. And the reason I haven't left Brazil until yesterday when I traveled here is because my government has very deliberately created a threatening climate where they want not only myself, but the colleagues with whom I've been working to be concerned about what our ability actually is to travel freely. And as a result, we've been called criminals, we've been called thieves, we've been called Edward Snowden's accomplices, we've had high-level officials in the Obama administration overtly arguing that we ought to be prosecuted for the journalism that we've been doing, despite the constitutional right that we in the United States have, like you in Germany have, that guarantees a free press. And I was a little bit uncertain about whether I ought to do that, whether that was a smart thing. And one of the reasons why I decided I would in this instance was because I felt very comfortable coming here to Berlin. And a reason that I was so comfortable is because other people who have been working with similar risks to tell not only the United States, but the entire world about this system of suspicionless surveillance have been here in Berlin working the entire time because they feel safe here, even though they don't feel safe in their home countries, namely the leaders of the free world, the United States and Great Britain, where they feel threatened. And that includes my very brilliant journalistic colleague, Laura Poitras, who has done so many of the critical stories here with Der Spiegel, and my equally brilliant friend, Jacob Appelbaum, who has reported on some of the most important Snowden documents, and Sarah Harrison as well, who so courageously went to Hong Kong as a representative of WikiLeaks and helped bring Edward Snowden to safety and ultimately to asylum. And the fact that they viewed Berlin as a safe haven, somewhere that they could actually do 10 months of work without undue interference, without being threatened, made me very comfortable and even excited to come here as well. I got to be with them, and I just got to be in a place where there is now developed a really wonderful tradition that may be of the best in the world for guaranteeing these basic civic freedoms to journalism. So thank you for providing that, and thank you for having me here as well. So besides just the ability to come to Berlin, another reason why I was excited to be here was because of the topic of the reason that we've gathered here today, which is honoring journalistic courage, incredibly courageous journalists who have been nominated for the Liberty Award. And it's really been interesting to me over the past 10 months because there are a lot of people who love to bash the media and criticize journalists. And I am definitely one of those people. I love attacking the media. And I think it's really actually well-deserved. But one of the things that I've gotten to really understand in a visceral way over the last 10 months because of the visibility of the work that I've been doing is just how many journalists there are around the world who are incredibly devoted to their craft and who pursue it with a stunning degree of courage. I mean, we just saw in that film probably a dozen who gave their lives in order to do that. And I've had people from around the world contact me and tell me about the work that they're doing in places all over the world. We happen to have an investigative journalism conference that's, I think, the biggest in the world that just happened to be in Rio de Janeiro where I live. So I got to meet hundreds of journalists who are engaged in incredibly courageous work with almost nobody knowing what it is that they're doing, really toiling in anonymity, which can actually make the work more dangerous. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we've been protected is because of the visibility of this story. There are journalists around the world who are challenging corrupt power factions who don't get on television, who aren't known to thousands of people, and therefore have no protection from reprisals. And one of the more moving episodes that I've experienced over the last 10 months was about 3 months ago when I went to speak at a journalism college in Rio de Janeiro about journalistic courage, and we spoke to maybe 500 or so journalism students. And I was there, and on the panel with me was a journalist who I had never heard of before. And I learned of his story right before the event and then heard him speak. And essentially, he's a journalist who works for a tiny little newspaper in a small town in the middle of Brazil. So basically in rural Brazil. And his newspaper is read by maybe 3,000 to 5,000 people. And he discovered, almost by a fluke, that there was extreme amounts of corruption in the police department that was the police department for the state in which his city was located. He realized he had seen an item in a budget that allocated $100,000 to a new police station 3 years ago, and he went to the spot, and there was a tiny little piece of wood, and it said 11th Police Delegation in front of it, and he realized that this was a scam. And the more he looked into it, the more he realized just how pervasive and systemic this fraud was. And it didn't only apply to finances, but to police violence and corruption. The more he dug into his police department, the more he realized it was basically like organized crime. And as he researched it more and began publishing articles on small amounts of corruption, he began getting rocks through his window, death threats posted to his door. He was beaten on several occasions, and yet he continued to pursue his journalism. And the threats got so serious that his wife left him in the middle of the journalism because she could no longer expose her children to what she thought was this danger. He actually experienced serious psychological problems, was in and out of a hospital several times. His newspaper wanted to fire him. He continued to get death threats, was beaten up 2 or 3 more times, and yet continued to pursue the story for over a year until the federal prosecutors finally intervened and put a bunch of the police officers in prison and cleaned up the department. And the reason that story is so amazing to me is because he continued to do this and risk everything that he had in his life and actually lost a lot of things in his life, really almost for no benefit. I mean, I probably still wouldn't have known about this story had he not sat next to me at that panel. Probably very few people had any idea of what he did. He didn't receive any prestigious awards. He never went on television. No one in the world knows who he is. And I actually just stopped in the middle of this event when people were asking me a lot of questions and just asked him, because I was really curious to know, what is it that motivated you to do that? I mean, why would you risk your life and get beaten up continuously and lose your marriage and your physical and mental health and put yourself and everybody you love through this extraordinary trauma simply to expose some police corruption? You know, it's probably the case that in the town right next to him, there's lots of police corruption. Probably 3 years from now, there'll be more police corruption in his town. What would motivate somebody, a journalist, to risk all that for so little? And what he said was that he doesn't actually consider himself a hero. And the answer that he gave me about why that is was actually the same exact answer that Edward Snowden gave me in Hong Kong when I asked him why, as a 29-year-old with an incredibly prosperous career and a beautiful girlfriend and a family that loves him and a stable life and everything ahead of him, why he would unravel all of that and throw that all away just for some abstract political objective or in order to protect other people's privacy, something that he was quite capable of doing for himself. He gave me the same answer as that reporter gave when I asked him on that panel, which is, I don't actually think I was doing anything selfless, because I knew that if I chose not to pursue this, if I chose to walk away from this injustice that I found, the pain that that would cause me as it sat on my conscience for the rest of my life would be so much worse than whatever those corrupt police officers or the United States government in Snowden's case could do to me. That police officer said, I would rather be killed or beaten or have rocks thrown through my window than know that I just let this extreme corruption continue, that this money was wasted on dirty police officers instead of on poor people. Just like Edward Snowden told me I would rather go to prison for the next 40 years. That would not be as bad as knowing that I could have done something to stop this system of mass surveillance and yet chose not to. And I really do think the more that I thought about this and the more people that I've met who display the kind of courage that we're here to honor tonight are driven by that same dynamic. It almost isn't so much about courage, but about conscience. I think that really is the core attribute. It's the idea that you cannot allow wars to go raging without informing the world of the savagery and brutality that's taking place because you don't want to live with yourself walking away. or the same with large and small scale corruption. And that to me is really the essence of journalistic courage, is the idea that as people of conscience, we don't want to allow things to go unchallenged. And I've had the opportunity to get to know a little bit of the work of the honorees here tonight, the nominees, as well as past winners, and that really is the really impressive strand that I think runs through it. And that's why I think people who engage in the kind of journalism that the nominees tonight have engaged in really deserve our extreme gratitude and admiration. So I want to talk I want to talk a little bit about the NSA story and how that relates to what it is that we're talking about tonight, because the work that I've been doing over the last 10 months obviously raises issues of things about surveillance and privacy and secrecy and all of those issues that obviously are arisen and that people around the world have been debating since we started reporting on these documents. But the story actually has a lot to do with journalism and journalistic courage, probably as much as, if not even more so, than the surveillance policies themselves. And that's true for a couple of reasons. Number one is, in a world in which certain governments, the United States and its English-speaking allies, principally in the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, in a world in which those countries are collecting everybody's communication records, literally everybody's. The goal of the NSA is collect it all. That's their motto. They wake up every day to figure out how they can eliminate privacy around the world, how they can make sure that everybody with whom you're communicating and everybody whom you email is known to them. In that kind of a world, it becomes difficult to understand not only how we can maintain our individual privacy. The reasons why our privacy is threatened from that are obvious, but it also becomes very difficult to understand how we can have a free press in a world in which the government knows every single person with whom we're all communicating. In order to do investigative journalism, in order to find out what people in power are doing that they don't want you to know and they don't want the public to know, we can't divine what those things are as journalists. We don't have a crystal ball. We need people inside of these organizations who are willing to come forward, often at risk to their own lives and their liberties, and tell us. And in order for them to do that, they need to feel that they can do that with the confidence that they're not going to be detected, that they can do it anonymously so that their lives aren't in danger. The same is true for people who inform on human rights abuses, or who speak to their lawyers about very sensitive things, or who do any number of other activities such as calling drug and alcohol clinics, or an HIV doctor, or an abortion clinic. And in a world in which the government is collecting everybody's communication data, it's almost impossible to have a free press, because the sources on which a free press rely will no longer feel confident going to journalists. They will know that if they do, there is a high risk that they're doing so will be known to the government or other people who can threaten them. And in the United States, this has had a serious effect on the ability to engage in a free press. That is an underappreciated aspect of the surveillance state that Edward Snowden enabled us to learn about. But the other aspect of how this story has related to journalism is something I've actually only been thinking about a little bit recently. I was talking to Laura Poitras, my journalism colleague, and she was in Hong Kong with me, and she's a documentary filmmaker, as you probably know, and she filmed almost everything that happened in Hong Kong. And she was talking to me a couple months ago as she was editing her film, and she was going through the conversations that I was having with Snowden when we were in Hong Kong and planning how the stories would unfold and what our strategy would be. And what she said was, and she said she didn't remember this, neither had I, was that we actually spent more time in Hong Kong talking about the media and journalism and how we would handle all of that than we did the surveillance policies themselves. And that was true. When she told me that sort of sunk in. I did remember that. And the reason for that is that we knew that as much as we were going to have an impact on how people thought about surveillance and secrecy and privacy, we were going to have probably a bigger impact on how people understood the proper function of journalism. That was something that we wanted to set out to do, was revitalize the idea that journalism is not journalism unless it's adversarial in nature, unless it's designed to provide checks on those people who wield the greatest power. And in the United States, one of the reasons we've had a fundamental failure of the press, I think the same is true in the UK, is because the press has reversed its function. Instead of being a check on those in power, instead of investigating those in power, it has become a servant to those in power. Instead of investigating and scrutinizing the message, it amplifies the message uncritically. There are all sorts of examples. The New York Times helping the Bush administration convince Americans of the need to invade Iraq is probably the most well-known, but there are so many others. And one of the things we did in Hong Kong was we tried to set out to think about how we were going to report this story in a way that fulfilled rather than contradicted the core premise and core promise and value of journalism. And to do that, we had to think a lot about what that essence of journalism is. And what we decided it actually was something grounded in the principle that power, no matter where it's found in the world, not just in Iran and Russia and China and all the other places we like to point to as tyrannies, but in our own countries, on national levels and local levels and elected officials and the police, that the nature of how human beings exercise power is that if they can exercise it without challenge and without investigation and without transparency and scrutiny, they will always abuse that power in very serious and substantial ways. And that journalism only has value if it is devoted to standing up to those in power, to being adversarial to them, to investigating the truth of what they're trying to disseminate to the citizenry, to uncovering that which they try to keep hidden. And it was very much about that idea of journalism that motivated how we ended up reporting the story and how we continue to report it. And it's why I'm always so inspired to be around other journalists around the world who are exhibiting such courage, because it reaffirms the idea that this is what journalism in its purest and most noble form is about, and that really emboldens me to continue doing what I'm doing. So I just want to leave with one last point. I make this point every time I have appeared in Germany through the magic of video by television. And so I would feel remiss if I didn't mention it while I'm here, which is this idea that I just mentioned, that the essence of journalism is the ability of our sources to come forward and provide us the information that we can then transmit to the public. So much of the journalism that we just saw in that film was enabled because brave people in those countries were willing to speak to journalists and come forward. And one way to break the freedom of the press and to destroy the ability to do journalism is to just throw journalists in prison en masse, the way that we saw in some of those countries is done. But there are other ways to do it too. One way is to threaten journalists with prison. Another way is to attack their sources and make it impossible for sources to come forward because they know their lives will be destroyed. And so I think as journalists, we have the obligation not only to defend one another and each other's freedom as journalists, but also to defend the right of our sources, people of conscience in government and other places who come forward and give us information. And the source for the story that I've been working on over the last 10 months, Edward Snowden, is somebody whose most basic rights are being threatened and persecuted in the most extreme ways. He is somebody who, if he goes back to his own country, will almost certainly spend the next several decades, if not the rest of his life, in prison for divulging information that almost the entire world recognizes as unbelievably vital and important and has triggered critical debates around the world. He exposed things that almost everybody of good faith believes ought to have been known and not hidden. And right now, unfortunately, there's only one country that is willing to actively protect him from that persecution. And it's a country that is doing that not because of its sterling commitment to civic virtues, but because it has pragmatic benefits from doing so. But it's nonetheless, regardless of their motives, the fact that that is the only country that's actively protecting him. And I think that every country in the world has the duty under international law and just through basic morality to protect him from persecution. But the countries that have benefited most from these revelations, which includes the country in which I live and the country in which I'm currently standing, I think have a particular obligation. Because what he did is sacrifice his own self-interest in order to protect the rights of everybody in this room and everybody who lives in this country and all of your elected leaders, as well as the people who live in my country of citizenship and my country of residence. And to then watch those same governments, to watch those same governments that have benefited so much by from his sacrifice turn around and refuse any sort of risk or any sort of cost or any sort of mild sacrifice in order to then protect his rights has been really difficult to watch, and I think kind of morally odious. And so what I hope is that as journalists we realize that our duty is not just to defend our sources, ourselves and call for freedom and protection for ourselves, but also for the people who enable the journalism, which is our sources. And I think in my particular case that means not letting Edward Snowden be threatened with life in prison, but doing the duty that every country has under the law to protect him from persecution. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me here. Good luck to all of the honorees who are extremely well deserving. I'm glad I'm not on the jury to pick. And thanks for coming.